My uncle brought a document to the reading of the will. Not the will my grandmother had filed with her attorney 17 years ago. A different document. Newer. 4 pages, notarized, dated 3 weeks before her death. He placed it on the conference table with both hands. The way you place something you are very confident about. My grandmother's attorney, a man named Gerald who had handled her estate for 2 decades, looked at the document without touching it. My uncle said, "She updated it. 3 weeks before she passed. The house goes to me." I looked at the date on the document. I said, "What date did you say?" My uncle said, "October 14th. I opened my bag. I had brought a folder. Not because I had known he would bring a document, because I had spent 6 years watching my uncle position himself as the person closest to my grandmother, and I had learned, over those 6 years, to prepare before sitting at any table he had organized. Inside the folder, my grandmother's medical records from her neurologist, the diagnosis date, the cognitive assessment from October, the one that had determined she required full-time memory care, the notation from her attending physician dated October 9th, 5 days before the document my uncle had just placed on the table. The notation said, "Patient is no longer capable of executing legal documents. Cognitive function assessed at severe impairment. Unable to recognize family members consistently or recall recent events." October 9th. His document was dated October 14th. I set the medical records on the table beside his document. Gerald picked up both. He read. He looked up at my uncle. He looked at me. He looked back at the records. The room was very quiet. "My name is Diana Cole. I am 41 years old. My grandmother, Ruth Cole, died in November at 84. She had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease 6 years earlier, a diagnosis that had arrived with the specific cruelty of a disease that takes someone slowly and in stages, so that the loss is not a single event, but a long series of smaller ones spread across years. I had been the family member who managed her care. Not because I was designated, because I was the one who showed up, who coordinated with the neurologist, who reviewed the care facility assessments, who understood, with increasing specificity over 6 years, exactly what her disease was doing and what she could and could not do at each stage. I am an estate attorney. I have spent 15 years working in estate planning and probate. I have seen families contest wills, challenge documents, and dispute inheritances in every variation the legal system permits. I knew what a valid will required. I knew what cognitive capacity meant in a legal context. I knew that a person with severe Alzheimer's impairment could not execute a legally valid document. I also knew, when my uncle placed that document on the table, exactly what I was looking at. I had simply been hoping I was wrong. I was not wrong. My Uncle Robert is my grandmother's son, 66 years old, a retired contractor who had moved back to Atlanta 5 years earlier after decades in Florida, and who had, from the moment he arrived, begun the slow process of repositioning himself as the person most essential to Ruth Cole's daily life. He drove her to appointments. He attended family dinners. He called her every morning and told us at every gathering how the call had gone. He was present in the way that is genuine and in the way that is strategic, and the two coexisted so seamlessly that I had spent years unable to fully name what I was watching. What I was watching was a man who had decided that proximity was a claim. My grandmother had a will, filed in 2007. Clear, specific, professionally prepared. The house, a 4-bedroom in Buckhead that she had owned since 1978, went to me. Not because I had done anything to earn it specifically, because my grandmother had told me directly, in 2018, that she wanted it to stay in the family's next generation, and that she trusted me to steward it. She had said that in a moment of clarity, in her kitchen, over coffee, when she still had coffee mornings and could still track a conversation for an hour before the fatigue set in. I had not told Robert she had said it. I had simply kept the medical records. I had not known he would bring a document, but I had known he might. 6 years of watching had produced a specific knowledge, that Robert believed the house should be his, that he had said as much to at least 3 family members, and that in the final months of my grandmother's decline, he had been present at the care facility more than anyone else. Being present at the care facility in the final months. I had thought about what that presence meant. I had thought about it, and I had not had the specific evidence to act on it, and I had done the thing a careful attorney does when evidence is incomplete. I had documented what I knew and waited. What I knew was in the folder. The neurologist's records from the past 3 years. The cognitive assessments, administered quarterly, showing the progression of impairment with clinical specificity. The October 9th notation that was the last formal assessment before my grandmother died in November. I had obtained these records 3 months earlier, not in anticipation of a specific event, in the way that an estate attorney who is also a granddaughter managing a parent's care keeps records, because records are the only thing that survives when memory fails and intention is disputed. Gerald read the October 9th notation twice. Gerald said, "Robert, this document is dated October 14th. Robert said, "She was having a good day." Gerald said, "The attending physician assessed her on October 9th as unable to execute legal documents due to severe cognitive impairment. A notarized document from 5 days later requires that the signatory have legal capacity. This notation from her physician raises a direct question about capacity on October 14th. Robert said, "She knew what she was signing." I said, "Robert, who was present when she signed?" He looked at me. I said, "Who was in the room?" A pause. Robert said, "Her and me and the notary." I said, "Which notary?" He named a name I did not recognize. I wrote it down. If you have ever watched someone position themselves over years for something that was never theirs, and prepared quietly for the moment they would try to take it, you already know why this story exists. Subscribe and hit the bell. I'll be here every week. Gerald suspended the reading pending investigation. This was the correct professional response, and I had expected it. A contested document with a capacity question required legal review before any distribution could proceed. I retained a probate litigation attorney, a woman named Susan who had handled contested wills for 20 years and who reviewed my folder on a Saturday morning with the focused efficiency of someone who had seen this pattern before. Susan said, "Diana, the October 9th notation is your anchor. Everything builds from it." She filed a formal challenge to the amended will on Monday. The grounds: lack of testamentary capacity. The supporting documentation: the October 9th neurologist assessment, the 3 years of quarterly cognitive decline records, and a sworn statement from my grandmother's attending physician confirming that her impairment on October 14th would have been consistent with the October 9th assessment. The attending physician's statement was the most important piece. He was careful and specific in the way that physicians are careful and specific when they understand that their documentation is going to matter in a legal proceeding. He stated that on October 9th, he had assessed Ruth Cole as lacking the cognitive capacity to execute legal documents. He stated that Alzheimer's disease, at the stage she had reached, did not produce good days that restored executive function sufficient for legal execution. He stated that the 5-day gap between his assessment and the document's date did not represent a clinically meaningful window of restored capacity. I read his statement 3 times. Then I sent it to Susan and asked her what came next. Susan said, "We request the notary's records. A notarization of a document signed by someone without legal capacity is itself invalid. The notary has an obligation to assess capacity before notarizing. If the notary failed to do so, or if the notary's records show something inconsistent with what actually happened, we have an additional basis for the challenge." She requested the notary's records. The notary's records showed that the appointment had lasted 11 minutes. 11 minutes for a 4-page legal document from a woman with severe Alzheimer's impairment. Susan said, 11 minutes is not sufficient time to assess capacity for a document of this complexity for a patient with this diagnosis. This notarization was deficient. I said, "What does deficient mean in practice?" Susan said, "It means the document has multiple independent grounds for invalidity, no capacity, deficient notarization, and, Diana, I want to ask you something directly." I said, "Ask." Susan said, "Do you want to pursue this criminally as well as civilly?" I sat with that question. My uncle, 66 years old, 6 years of Sunday dinners and morning phone calls, and driving my grandmother to appointments. A man who had loved her and who had also, in the final weeks of her life, brought a notary into her room and placed a document in front of her and guided her hand to a signature line. I knew he had guided her hand. I knew this because her signature on the amended document bore no resemblance to her actual signature. It was a mark, barely a letter, the kind that a person makes when someone else positions the pen. I said, "Pursue the civil challenge fully. Hold the criminal referral unless the civil process requires it." Susan said, "Understood. If this moment stayed with you, leave me a comment. Has someone ever waited until someone you loved was at their most vulnerable to take what they wanted? Tell me what you did. I read every single one." The civil challenge resolved in 4 months. Robert's attorney contested the challenge with 2 arguments. First, that my grandmother had been having a good day on October 14th. Second, that the October 9th assessment was one physician's opinion and not determinative of capacity on a different date. Both arguments failed. The first failed because the attending physician testified that good days in late-stage Alzheimer's do not restore executive functions sufficient for legal execution. The disease does not work that way. The neurological impairment is structural and progressive, not episodic. The second failed because the burden of proof in a capacity challenge rests with the party asserting capacity. Robert had to prove she had capacity on October 14th. The October 9th assessment, the disease progression records, and the 11-minute notarization combined to create a picture he could not overcome with testimony that she had seemed present that day. The probate court voided the amended will. The 2007 will was reinstated. The house in Buckhead, the 4-bedroom my grandmother had owned since 1978, passed to me. I stood in the house on the first weekend after the transfer was finalized. Just me and the rooms I had visited my whole life. The kitchen where she had made biscuits every Sunday. The back porch where she had kept a garden that was more stubborn than organized. The bedroom where I had sat beside her in her last years when the coffee mornings had stopped and the clarity had faded, and what remained was her hand in mine and the specific peace of being present without needing her to know who I was. She had known who I was. Not always by name at the end, but she had known. The way she held my hand was different from how she held other hands. I had noticed that and held on to it. Robert and I have not spoken since the probate ruling. His attorney filed a notice of appeal that was subsequently withdrawn. I do not know what he does now or whether he has found a way to make sense of what he did. I am still working on making sense of it myself. Not with anger, with the specific grief of understanding that someone who loved my grandmother also exploited her in her most helpless moment. Both things were true. I cannot make one disappear by holding the other. The house needs work. The garden is overgrown. The kitchen needs updating. I am doing it slowly, one room at a time. I am 41 years old, and my uncle brought a notarized document to a will reading that had been signed by a woman with severe Alzheimer's impairment 5 days after her physician certified she lacked capacity to execute legal documents. The first thing, get medical records when you are managing someone's end-of-life care. Not because you expect a dispute, because the records are the only objective record of what was happening and when. Cognitive decline produces no external markers that are visible in a moment. A person with severe Alzheimer's impairment can seem present to someone who sees them briefly and infrequently. The medical records are the documentation that shows the full picture rather than a selected moment. I had the records because I was the family member managing the care. If you are in that position, keep copies. Request the formal assessments. Know what the clinical documentation says about capacity and about the progression of the disease. This is not preparation for a dispute. It is the responsible management of someone's care. The fact that it also becomes the most important document in a legal proceeding is secondary. The second thing is about notarization and what it is supposed to mean. A notary public is required to assess whether the person signing a document has the capacity to sign it. This is not a formality. It is a legal obligation. A notarization of a document signed by someone without capacity is deficient, and the document can be challenged on that basis. If you are present when an elderly person with cognitive impairment is asked to sign a document, particularly if the person bringing the document is a family member with a financial interest in the outcome, you have the right to ask questions. Who is the notary? How long did the assessment take? What questions were asked to evaluate capacity? The answers tell you whether the process was legitimate. 11 minutes is not sufficient. I know this now as a fact documented in a court record. It was not sufficient then either. It simply was not challenged until someone brought the medical records. The third thing is the most personal. My uncle loved my grandmother. I believe this. He called her every morning for 5 years. He drove her to appointments. He sat beside her in the memory care facility when visiting was allowed, and held her hand the way I held her hand, and experienced her the way all of us experienced her. As someone who was still present in the ways that mattered even when the words had gone. He also guided her hand to a signature line on a document she could not read or understand, and brought a notary who spent 11 minutes on something that required hours. Both things are true. I have sat with both of them for months, and I have not found a frame that makes them fit together cleanly. What I have found is that the law does not require them to fit together. The law requires only that the document be valid. It was not. The house is mine. The garden is overgrown. My grandmother's biscuit recipe is in the kitchen drawer where she always kept it. I will learn to make them. She would want that. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to prepare for a moment you hoped would not come, and then watched it come exactly the way you had prepared for it? And which moment stayed with you longer, the date on his document, or standing in the house alone after the transfer? I read every single one. If this story reached you today, subscribe. What comes next will stay with you too.